So the question is how do you find the time to do everything? Right. And I think that that is the sort of critical question. You don't have enough resources. You're creating something from nothing. And time is a really, really valuable resource, but also, financial resources, those are really, really important things. There's all sorts of resources that you need if you're creating a project that doesn't exist. And frankly, you don't have time for it, right? There is very little that you can actually do. And, the entrepreneurship literature talks about either creating or um, making or identifying opportunities, right? So maybe opportunity, it's kind of a mute discussion, I think, but it's been ongoing for a while, right? So you have these, um, opportunities that exist. This is one particular perspective that exists in the wild, and entrepreneurs go and pick them. The other one is that entrepreneurs actually create opportunities, right? They make them happen. What is sort of less discussed, and it's not necessarily as up in the front, is norms violation. And where you are, you don't have enough resources, and you look at the sort of normal behavior of the way things are meant to be done, or how you're supposed to do things, or how you feel things should be done, or you look around everybody else around you and they're doing it this certain way. Well, if you're doing something entrepreneurial, you have to violate norms of the way that things have been done in the past, and you have to actively think about how can I actually do the same thing given that I don't have any resources. So right now I'm building the reciprocity project. I work a full-time job as a researcher. I teach as at school. I have kids, two kids, um, and frankly, sometimes I want to spend some time with my wife, right? So I have very little time to do this, but I realize that there's all these sort of interstitial parts of my life that can actually be devoted to a project like this. So every time I'm commuting, for example, I'm working on the reciprocity project. Every time that I am walking or exercising, I usually do something like that. And I'll make just kind of silly videos every once in a while. Or, on my way to work, I'll do something like that. And then the other thing is to not worry about the quality, because frankly, that idea of quality is made up. You don't necessarily know what quality is. It's a sort of characteristic that the audience actually makes up. And there's many moments where you think, oh, this is really poor quality, and nobody's going to want to listen to this, or nobody's ever going to want to watch this or read this. But it's exactly what somebody else needs, because they're going through the same thing, and then they see um, what they would actually prefer. So for me, right, when I look at, sometimes I'll watch some of the older reciprocity videos, not many, but especially the ones that I can hear my kids in the background goofing around and screaming. I can, I sort of wander into just these interesting moments where my kids pop up, and somehow, and I love that because it reminds me of a time when I was doing this, and I can hear the kids going nuts, going crazy in the background, screaming and all this kind of crazy stuff. And I love that. It gives me a lot of sort of warm fuzzies inside. And at that time, I was stressed out because I was thinking, oh, this is not proper, and nobody's going to like this kind of stuff. And frankly, I look back and those are the most interesting things. Or when there's something goofy going on in the background, and that is the most interesting things, right? I did a few years ago, I did impressions with my kids during COVID. This was it. And I didn't show the kids, but that you can hear them talking in the background. I didn't want them to be revealed early when they're very young. Um, but that was really fun, and that was a very difficult thing for me to do. And yes, it was terrible impressions, but we were goofing around and having fun. And so every once in a while, I get a comment on how terrible the impressions are, right? But so what? Right? Like that is the important thing. And as me as a professor, like think about my role and how I should behave. Everything about what I should do should be proper. People should, I'm teaching the next generation of managers, sort of executives, all of this stuff, right? And if you look at, I dare you to go look at LinkedIn and look at business professor posts, they're all about how proper you should be. And you're dressed up in a suit and you're abiding by these very strong norms. And here I am, I'm posting on LinkedIn these impressions, right? Like, what a crazy norms violation. But I am trying to do this in my spare time, but also practice what it means to be me and have a conversation with you in how I feel about my life. I'm not a let's wear a suit all the time kind of thing. I'm pretty chill as a person inside. I do value the honor, I do value wearing a suit. I get it. But at the same time, that's not who I am on a regular basis. I'm pretty chill. I'm either wearing shorts or, I'm just wearing some jeans or something like that, right? But all of this is to say, how do you actually accomplish things when you don't have the resources? You violate norms. You have to look for things that are relatively minor, but they still feel, when you do it, they feel uncomfortable. Now, I'll give you another example, right? So, um, my job, one of the problems with my job and reason why I actually don't talk about my institution that often is because we have technology transfer issues going, intellectual property issues that are going on, right? So to distance myself from my institution, remember when this all started out, I actually tried to go and work with a technology transfer office, and it just did not work out because they were looking for a certain kind of intellectual property that was basically patents. It's not easy to patent software. It's not easy to, and even still, like who are you going to sell this to, right? So it wasn't the project itself, right? The reciprocity project itself wasn't necessarily anything that other people might be interested in at the time because it was still just being made up. Um, and the thing is I'm violating norms every time I do this because the normal thing to do as a tenure track professor, and tenure track professor is different than many professors, but our job is to do research repeatedly. And so my career, by signaling I'm doing something like this, I'm extremely well aware that this is not the norm within a research community. I get comments roughly every time I interact with the public in various different ways about how, and they're subtle, right? They're little jabs where the sort of activities are not proper. Maybe I shouldn't be it's a valuable thing to do, but this is not my time is not being spent wisely, right? Like all these kind of little subtle things that you get, that this is what it means to be a proper researcher. This is what it means to be a proper academic. These little tiny things, and generally, many of the sort of comments are not necessarily people might not be aware of what I'm doing, but I'm very aware of it. I'm very conscious of that and what that actually means. And it's like kind of being an outsider of sorts, right? So maybe you're a minority and you're listening to this. You completely understand what I'm talking about. Is you interpret every sort of comment in a way that you think they're talking to you and you're processing it. And I feel like an outsider often, right? Like you're processing it in such a way that, or you're framing it in such a way that you feel all of those little comments because this is out of the norm. This is not normal to do something like this. And so being not normal, you will not find hardly any other tenure track professors, unless they're very full professors and they're sort of long done their career. You will not see anybody that's sort of doing this, the reciprocity project, talking to you, building software, commercialized software particularly within business school. We have these very strong norms that are at play, right? Because we have to fight against what it means to be a practitioner. Um, there's all these sort of norms that you're fighting against, and as you're doing that, you have to sort of walk your line of, hey, I'm okay. This is me, right? And I'm doing just fine with who I am. Thank you. And you get practice doing that because everybody's got their conception, right? You can think of the audience, you think of everybody, is they all got their conception of what life should be about and what it's about and all that kind of stuff, right? Everybody believes that their sort of path is the right path to so go, and they don't sort of think about things, right? Um, but and I smile because I'm reflecting on myself, right? Like, I think it's hilarious that I'm talking about giving this sort of advice and all that kind of crap. um, I think it's hilarious, but here's the thing: is that you have to do these norm violations, right, in order to actually get anything done. And so my commute, I look around, people are listening to music, people are doing their thing, they're zoning out, and here I am talking to you, in a really peculiar kind of way, right? Like, it's really strange. And then the other thing is, the sort of quality. Everybody sort of worries about if I'm going to do a podcast, or if I'm going to do YouTube videos, if I'm going to write things, it's got to be perfect, right? So there are ways you can violate norms. So not only, relaxing the quality, not only, and just saying, hey, that's fine, just put it up, right? Like, who cares? And it doesn't matter, right? Like, most of the time, it doesn't matter. Um, and you will, if you're fighting about quality, you're going to be grappling for things, and you don't know what everybody likes. You have no idea, and so you just do what you do, um, and you just enjoy it. And yes, there's probably, I can hire people to make this spectacularly better in so many different ways, but I don't have the time, I don't have the resources. And this was at a time when when I started the Reciprocity Project, it was pre-tenure. I was about 3 or 4 years away from tenure. I thought, hey, I'm going to create this platform everybody's going to love, and all the, this might be something that I'm going to get tenure for. And man, was I ever wrong with that, right? And with tenure, this is another thing, right? Or getting a full professor. People don't know this outside world stuff or inside world stuff. What you do, the only thing that matters, the only thing that matters, is that you are doing research, and anything that deviates from that, whether it's teaching, whether it is, interacting, consulting, whatever you might call it, all of that stuff is a waste, and it's viewed as a waste, right? And it's viewed as like, oh, you shouldn't have been doing that. You're not serious enough. Um, and and everything about that. But what you got to realize is that you have to frame it in such a way that you feel good about yourself, right? So one of the norms violations is framing it, or techniques that I've learned is that I frame this to make myself feel better about doing it, right? And I think about, like, how can I do this so that I view this as I feel good about doing these norms violations. So one of the techniques is me viewing this as charity, and it really is. It really is just kind of, there's no value, immediate value that I can extract from this particular relationship. I can't, right? I don't know who you are. You don't really know who I am. Maybe you have a better idea of who I am, but there's very little that I can get out of this relationship. And so far, it hasn't been like, oh, this breakthrough, I'm making a bunch of money and all that kind of stuff. That's not what happens. Um, so there's that, but then there's also, treating it as like, I'm horsing around, I'm having fun. This is my relaxing time, my vacation, things. And you'll see that I do this on the weekend a lot because I do enjoy it. This is interesting. the sort of slow build thing. It is interesting. And it's not only, here's the thing, um, it's not only work that you get these sort of pressures from, and maybe they're pressures that are made up in your mind too. You don't necessarily know. It's kind of a difficult thing to sort of imagine, right? You don't really know what it means, what everybody else is thinking, and you kind of just have these sort of slight jabs to go by. Um, and it could be your family too, right? Like, so it is difficult. Yeah, I'm going to be very honest here. To waste money on something that is sort of fledgling along, it's kind of taken a kind of weird negotiation with my wife, right? In the beginning, I think she was sort of on board, and she could maybe see that there's potential. But now it just seems like, hey, this is kind of like an ongoing thing where we're just keeping money and putting money into this thing, and it really is not panning out, right? So, this is the challenging component of doing this, is figuring out, that you have to violate all of these norms, right? And so that's an ongoing discussion. That's a challenging thing for me to face. I don't know what the right answer is. It's very awkward, in many different ways with me. And that one is, I'm still trying to, I think it's become kind of like a, maybe what we should do is, view this as your hobby, right? And because it's your hobby, it's okay to sort of spend some money on this, right? We're at that point at this moment. Um, and then the other one is, so another important thing for norms violations and how to do this is to use technology that people feel uncomfortable about in various different ways, right? So you'll see that I adopt, I'm on YouTube, for example, right? Like, you find that I publish things a lot on social media, and the norm is either to publish things that are very self-serving, very, very self-serving, or, not at all. And so I get those two responses, right? I either get this is promotional for me, or I'm not on social media. And those two responses are totally fine, but I choose to violate a norm and go do something completely different, and give encouragement and allow other people to focus on being on other people, not the focus on myself. And this is intentional, in terms of how to manage this. And I'll talk about that, in sort of the future. Well, actually, let me talk about it now. Why I actually do that is because, to build relationships, the focus should be always on other people. And I think, how we do social media is completely backwards. I never feel good on social media, right? And this is human nature, to do this sort of self-serving stuff. And so my tendency for a long time was to avoid it, and not be on it. And every time I went on it, I feel terrible. I still feel every once in a while, when I start going on it, I feel terrible. But what I realize, how I feel good and I feel wonderful about myself, is by, um, by encouraging other people, and is by never focusing on myself. I actually feel better for doing that. I feel actually really fun, and enlightened, and hopefully other people feel the same way. I don't know, but that's what you that's the my thought process, and it actually has helped. It's making me feel like I'm a better person, and that's all that matters. Now, the sort of last technology is using things like AI, using tools that sort of speed up your process a lot, right? So ChatGPT has been a big breakthrough in the last year. It's the summer of 2023, and that's been a really big thing. And the number of people that are uncomfortable using it for various different reasons, all sorts of different reasons. If you're an expert, you're uncomfortable because you're relying on somebody else that you think is inferior, or a machine that you think is inferior. If you are just starting out, you're afraid of being caught, afraid of being, exposed. And there's a lot that goes on with this. And so using it forth, like aggressively using it, is very strong norms violation, and you lean into it so you feel that you're doing the best possible thing that you can do at the time. And the only way you can get things done is to use these available technologies. And one more, I do use, Upwork. I found great people in Upwork that can help out in various different ways. So having a writer, for example, I often don't have time to write things. I had a writer for a long time that I was paying like a freelance writer. Developers in another country where frankly, I'm going to be honest, I can't afford to pay the prices that we pay in North America. And when I started the development, actually, I'm going to talk about this for a little bit of time here. So when I started to do development on the reciprocity platform, I knew I didn't have any time available to do it myself. I can't dedicate resources as quote unquote the entrepreneur in this scenario, right? So then I had to sort of view myself as, okay, if I can't do that, then I have to find other ways to actually get this done. So I initially tried to find a team to put together here in the city that I'm living in, but it doesn't have a strong entrepreneurial ecosystem. There has a small one, but it's not necessarily strong. And the culture is such that, it's hard to incentivize people to do things when they, they can't sort of see the same pictures of what you're seeing. And so you have to actually get people on the payroll, right? So you have to think about how to actually pay people. And so once I tried to get that team together, as I mentioned earlier in the book, and it fell apart, then I had to think about, like, how do I actually broach this problem? And so I tried to find a developer in town. I had a sort of connection. I had a couple of meetings that fell through in the sense that, that just was not interested in this. And so the only way that I can find people that would fit within what I was trying to do was to look in unusual places, right? And so the norms violation right there is looking for ways I can find labor that was a lot cheaper than what I can personally afford in the location where we were. And so I had to use a platform called Upwork, which is a freelancer platform. And I found a team from first in the Ukraine. And after some time, that did not work out with that particular team. And then I found another team in India. And because I was able to do that, I was able to complete the sort of software development as I was doing this and build it out over time without dedicating my time and effort to it. So I was able to continue with development and do the, actually make the platform itself. Now, the challenge is that this is somewhat violating norms because it is, what I can afford to pay is probably a lot less than what a developer would be paying. Well, it is a lot less than what a developer gets paid in the city that I live in. And so it feels awkward for me to pay a lot less than what the sort of going rate is here. And it feels somewhat like I'm violating a norm, right? When you're actually doing this, it feels like you're underpaying somebody, but then I have to put this in within sort of the, within the domain of where they live and, sort of the idea of I end up checking in a lot, or periodically to say that, is everything okay? And there is this sort of uncomfortableness with it, that I still am not necessarily comfortable with, not in the sense that, it is, that I feel like, I just feel very much like I'm not doing the right thing, right? And that's how you sort of view this when you're creating something. And the reason why I end up having to do the sort of development in another country is because it's just too expensive, and the entrepreneurial venture would not get started without that. And so without being able to access these resources that seem, it does seem like a norms violation. It feels very uncomfortable when you're sort of working outside of, the area that you're working in, without the geographic region. It just feels uncomfortable, especially when there is labor within the particular area, but it's just like you can't afford it. And so the only way that you can make something is by looking for these opportunities like that, where you're slightly violating norms and what it means to do business. Now, the other thing that you go through when you're building something like this is experiencing So the other thing that you go through when you do something like this, I apologize for the slight delay there, is when you're communicating to the outside world, you have to think about supply and demand. And this is one thing, the marketing side of things. Things that are within the norm, within the sort of existing knowledge, are actually already saturated. And this is probably less than 4 or less than 5. And that's because there's already a formed market there. If you're thinking about the idea of Blue Ocean Strategy, which is a well-known strategy book, you're playing, if there's already existing norms that are in play, it means that there's already a well-understood market, and the supply and demand are matched quite readily, and the sort of pricing of things are matched quite fairly, and you're not likely going to make some profit there. And so with social media marketing, what I realized after doing this for a long time, first on YouTube and then sort of other platforms now that you can find me, is that the things that resonate with people is where there is actually quite a big demand, but not enough supply. So what are those things? It typically means those are the things that it's uncomfortable to talk about, and people don't want to actually talk about these things, or things that are, humorous or make you funny, but, why are things humorous? Right? The reason why you actually laugh at something is because there's kind of a norms violation that occurs, right? Where you are thinking in one thing, and then all of a sudden the writer or the comedian or whoever is saying a complete opposite, and that sort of strikes you as funny. It's like, oh, that's weird. And that's kind of what you're looking for in these moments where you should be doing something else, right? We know what the right thing to do. So on social media, as I was mentioning, for a professor, it's particularly of business and strategy, I should be very proper, and I should tell either, 2 stories, right? One of them is being self-interested and telling how amazing I actually am, and sort of doing self-promotion. Or the other thing is not doing anything at all, right? Those are 2 very important norms or established norms. But, I choose to do something that's completely different, where I'm trying to sort of somewhat open up the kimono, as this saying goes, and sort of reveals what the inside world is, so that other people can see it. But then as well, give the emphasis is on other people, and the emphasis is on
helping and encouraging other people, which is really different and unique within the particular field of sort of academic research, where you're just saying things. It's a bit of an established norm to do that within the proper channels, but especially on social media, it's not an established norm to do that. And in fact, it is considered somewhat taboo to be as open as I am, right? And so there's part of the reason why I end up getting some traction. And the only ones that really do get traction are the ones that are sort of touching upon somewhat tricky subjects in different ways, right? Whatever the tricky subject might be, where there is some sort of norms violation that's actually occurring, those are the ones that seems to actually get some sort of resonance that exists, right? Where there is a need for people to talk about it, but people don't necessarily address it. And so the other thing to point out is that these norms violations, it is a marketplace, and they change over time, right? So the ones that are actually valuable today might not be valuable in 5-10 years from now. They're constantly changing depending on the sort of external environment and how comfortable people feel, just a lot of cultural elements that do change, and as well as the supply of people actually providing those things. So when I started this, the supply was actually quite limited, but now I'm realizing that there's actually far more supply, because people are actually starting to see the value of doing some of these things over time. So I think that's where I'm going to end this, is think about all the times that you might experience in order to sort of grow and to gain traction. You have to look for those moments that are underserved. And so what does that mean? What are the moments or opportunities that are underserved? Those are the ones that people are careful or uncomfortable to talk about, or doing things that are not necessarily what many people would say are the right things to do. And as soon as you see those sort of moments where people are saying, that's not what I would do, or that's not the right thing to do, we don't do that thing around here, those are the norms violations that you can actually pursue as entrepreneurial opportunities. So I think that is the key thing, is looking for those moments where you're looking for 10 years out, what are the norms going to be? How is that going to feel? And if you look at development of science, for example, that is often the case, that early on somebody does something that is strikingly different, and then it becomes the norm. And it's the same thing within culture as well. So music, right? Elvis Presley seemed to be very aggressive with what he was doing at the time, which attracted an audience, but then everybody else sort of seen what he was doing, copied what he was doing, and then now the actions that Elvis Presley did is not necessarily all that dramatic in any sort of way. So we have to think about, what does this actually mean? How do you do norms violations that are not necessarily, they won't be taboo in 10 years. And that's kind of the challenging thing to think about. What are the difficult things that you can do that are unique and different, but at the same time don't isolate you from a larger audience, in sort of resonating with what the sort of a small group or a small community actually might be thinking and feeling at a given moment. All right, we'll see you on the next one. So the idea is not necessarily to worry about how you feel about yourself when you're doing these things. And this is a really difficult thing, is that in order to do something that is unique and different, you often have to do things that are unique and different. And then by default, you're often violating norms and how you should actually behave and what you should actually do, and what the external audience actually is thinking about. So you have to go into things that don't necessarily fit with how you view yourself and maybe how the external audience views yourself, to find something that you actually create, right? So there's this idea of middle status conformity that has been talked about within the sociology literature, where we want to conform, and those on the sort of lower end of status, they do things because that they just don't necessarily fit in. And then at the upper ends of the status, they could do things because they don't necessarily, they don't necessarily need to conform, because they're the leaders of what's going on. And so I think if you are thinking about doing something that's entrepreneurial, realize the only way that you can do things that will break the mold and do something that is unique or something that will add value is thinking about what are the norms that you can violate yourself in order to do what you want to create. So for me, it's my commute into work, for example. It's using the sort of silly little cell phone that I have in my pocket. For me, it's sort of thinking about, I'm just doing these silly little videos or silly little talks that, it's just little old me, right? And thinking about those kind of things that, hey, at this time it feels very rinky dinky. At this time it feels like this is kind of dumb, all of those feelings that this is not really worthwhile. Why am I doing that? All of those emotions are going to come with the sort of norm violations, because you're doing something that is distinct, but that is the only way that you create something. So there's this another perspective of entrepreneurship that I think is really important in sort of innovation, is that it's really just randomness. And so you have this sort of norm of how things actually happen, but it's the random actions that actually drive a lot of behavior. And drive a lot of outcomes, because we don't necessarily know what those random actions, which ones will actually pay off. And sort of do those random actions, to do stuff that's unique and different, it requires you to violate norms on a regular basis, to sort of do things that are that don't fit, and to explore where things are different, unique, where you can actually add value. You often have to violate norms that you wouldn't necessarily do, or that is appropriate. So it would be beneficial for anybody that's thinking of doing something like this, is to get used to feeling like you're sticking out like a sore thumb. Now, there's this amazing video, it was a TED Talk, and it was about how do you start how do you start a movement? I think it's believed, or I think it talks about, but it's this lone nut that's dancing in the corner, doing his sort of thing at a music concert. And then pretty soon, over the course of 5-10 minutes, many people start dancing with this lone nut. And so that's what you kind of have to do, is sort of stick out from what the norm is. People are sort of used to doing things in a certain way, and it looks weird and it feels weird. And it's uncomfortable, but that's how you actually do stuff and create things, is look for ways that you can do something that keeps you in constant motion, rather than thinking about doing the appropriate thing. You do things that will actually move towards the direction of what you want to create, and then not worry about the appropriateness, not worry about how you feel about it, and just keep doing it. And as you keep doing it, good things actually start to happen, whether you actually create something or that something actually has tangible rewards associated with it. And both those things are actually really quite wonderful to experience. All right, take care.